Right, Colonial America up to 1763. Our major question is, did Americans want independence before 1763? And so we're kind of looking at these very, very early root causes. What was life like back then? And were we already thinking about breaking away from England? So let's start with population. And that why did we grow so rapidly? By the 1750s, England had already, or Britain, controlled 13 colonies in America. Between 1700 and 1763, the population increased from just 250,000 at the beginning of the century, and by 1763 we're up to 2 million, and so we're growing at a very, very rapid rate. And a couple reasons why. One is a very high birth rate, in that we are just having lots and lots of babies. The average American woman was having 7 children, and yay for us, they were living, so there was also a very low death rate. And that Americans were also living longer than Europeans. One of the reasons as far as that low death rates is we had more space, and so we weren't in big nasty cities with a lot of disease. We had wide open spaces with less disease. Another major reason as far as why we're growing so fast is people were moving here. And so we had large amounts of immigration, and then combine that with forced immigration via the slave trade, we're growing at a much faster rate than any European place all over. And so we are doubling every 25 years. We're doubling in size. And so at the beginning of the century, in 1700, the ratio was 20 British people to 1 American. By the time the revolution starts, we are at 3 British to 1 American. So very, very quickly, we're catching up. And it's not too far after that that we surpass them, because of our high birth rate, low death rate, and high immigration status. Now, we still only had 5 big cities. We had Boston, Newport, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. But most Americans didn't live in the big cities. Most Americans lived in rural areas, which allowed for this better health. And we just had all these wide open spaces, so we kept using them throughout the United States. And so if you look at this chart, you can kind of see that massive population growth. You can also break it down according to what region people are living in. And so you can see, obviously, the South is growing at a much higher rate than anybody else, than any other region. And I think a lot of reason there is slavery, and that they are literally importing more people than the rest of the colonies. And so as far as what did we look like, well, we started to become a melting pot, unlike the Europeans had ever seen before. 400,000 people migrated to the colonies between 1700 and 1763. Now, in the first century, in the 1600s, most of those settlers were English, and so we got a whole bunch of English people moving in. But by the 1700s, not so much. We started to have more variety as far as who's moving in, and then only 20% of migrants in the 1700s were English. So who was moving in? Well, still mostly whites, but a wide variety of whites. So it's still a melting pot. There's a lot of different people, but it's still a very pale pot. And so we're getting Scottish people, Germans, Scots-Irish, the Irish, the Dutch, the French, Swedes, Jews, all sorts of other European groups are moving in besides just the English. And so we're getting mixed unlike anywhere else. And we had a different attitude toward a lot of these ethnicities, and so we allowed for marriage between these ethnic groups, unseen in Europe again. And so this results in a multicultural American society where we become American, and we're mixing all these different European ethnicities so that they're identifying as white and American, but less identification with these other groupings. By 1760, only half the American population was English, and that we started mixing in everybody else. Now we're also including West Africans are being brought in as slaves. By 1763, we had 350,000 slaves in America, and that was about 20% of the population. And so this chart kind of breaks down as far as what did we look like right after the revolution. And we were about half 100% English, about 20 African, and then a breakdown piece by piece. But over time, these lines kind of get blurry as all these European groups are intermarrying each other. So as far as government, so did we govern ourselves? Mostly, yeah, we kind of got to rule over ourselves, and we kind of got spoiled for a while without a king. And there were three major types of colonies. The royal colonies, and that's the majority. You can see that in the map in pink. And the governor was appointed by the king. So the main guy in charge, the king got to pick his friends and send them over. And that's how most cases, most colonies worked. But there are some differences too. The proprietary colonies, this is where the crown gave authority to certain families, so kind of his favored families. They get to kind of rule over that colony, and the families get to do what they want. And so this is Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware. And so this would be where these families, they get to appoint the governor, and then they get to do whatever they like. If they don't like the governor, they can kick him out. And then a couple small colonies, the corporate colonies, where these colonies had special permission from the king, they had charters that gave them more freedom. And so in this case, the people would vote for their own governors. The governor's authority was limited as far as what they could or could not do. At any point, if the king did not like the governor, the king could kick him out and dismiss them. And the governor was really dependent on the actual government, on the regular legislature to get money. And so if they wanted even their own salaries, they had to get approval from the Congress to actually buy anything to use that money at all. And so what about that Congress? How did that work? The colonial assemblies. And so in most cases, it's a bicameral legislature. That means two chambers. And here's how it's breaking down. We have the upper house, and those were known as the upper houses or councils. And these were the governor's buddies. And the governor would kind of pick out the elite rich guys to serve as his personal counsel. And then the lower house, that's elected kind of like the House of Representatives as it is today. The governors had a bit of power in that they could just get rid of an assembly. If they didn't like what the assembly was doing, they could just veto in that they could abolish a law or just get rid of the whole assembly and start over. But the assemblies had power too. In that the assemblies, they had the power to raise monies through taxes. They had the power to spend that money any way they pleased. And they had the power to make local laws. So they had quite a lot of power. The governor's just kind of there to intervene anytime the governor sees something he doesn't like. The governor is seen as the king's representative. The king is not able to come over and rule over these Americans, and so the governor is there as this intermediary. And most of the actual power and duties, it's going to be down to the Colonial Assembly. As far as, well, how do the voters vote? 50% of white adult male, 21-year-old property owners can vote. Compared to England, that was only 15% in England had the right to vote. And in America, not all white men owned enough property to vote. And they had to be white, male, 21, and they had to own property in order to have the right to vote. This leaves out a whole bunch of other people, but it's a step forward when it comes to the right to vote. We got a ways to go, but it's baby steps in American voting rights. Women, slaves could not vote. And then even if you did own property, you had to have a certain amount of property if you wanted to actually run. And so this resulted in mostly rich people only having enough property to actually run to become part of the legislature. I mentioned charters a little bit earlier, and that this was a kind of permission slip from the king that allowed a colony to kind of do whatever they wanted. And so because the king's not going to come over 3,000 miles, this allows them to kind of have free reign and create their own laws. And if the king doesn't like it, he can remove that charter or adjust the charter. And so just think of it as a permission slip where he says, okay, you guys go have fun and rule over yourselves, don't embarrass me. As far as watching over the colonial supervision, the governors would, and the governor is also responsible to some of the king's main appointees. And so you've got the Board of Trade, which is going to look at colonial appointments and kind of advise the governors and the colonial legislatures. And the Secretary of State for the Southern Department is also going to, again, watch over trade, watch over the governors. America is 3,000 miles from Britain, so the governor left us alone for about 200 years. And so we just kind of ruled over ourselves with very little interference from the actual king. Besides trade regulations, a parliament did not affect us. A English parliament did not rule over us. We had our own parliament. We had our own Congress, and we had a king that was pretty much ignoring us. So for 200 years, we just did it ourselves. And so moving on to the economy. Between 1650 and 1770, the colonial gross product grew annually by 3.2%. So we were making a lot of money. How did we make so much money? Well, a couple different reasons. And one was we started to have more intercolonial trade. So the 13 colonies started to become more united because you can see in this little map, all the trails and roads started to pop up where we started to work with each other and become more of a united states. Instead of just a whole bunch of individual colonies connected to England, now we started to become a whole bunch of individual colonies more interconnected to each other than back to England. And so we're trading with each other more and more. And so we'd make products and not just ship them back to England, we'd make products and sell them to each other. And we were still selling plenty back to England as well. We had availability of loans from Britain in that because we were growing, a lot of businessmen in England said, hey, I'll give you $1,000 to start a new business, and I want to have part of that business, and you're going to pay back that loan, and we're all going to make money. And so lots of loans were popping up, new businesses. There was more population, therefore there's a lot more workers, and there's people to sell things to. So an increased population is going to help an economy too. And we had one thing that England didn't have, tons of people, but also tons of land. And so it was very easy to expand out your business because there's so much land. And we were also diversifying. We started to have more and more products. And so as a result, our economy was really booming. Most of us Americans were farming at some level. And so 90% of Americans were farmers in some capacity. In New England, and mostly these are small subsistence farms. That means people are just growing their own food and being self-sufficient. In the middle colonies, that's kind of the tri-state, New Jersey, New York, Philadelphia area, Pennsylvania area, they're really good at wheat farming. And so this is kind of the breadbasket. And so if we wanted to have flour, this is where we go. And so they were making enough flour for America, but they're also exporting a lot of that flour to produce bread in the Caribbean and for Europe. And so this was kind of the breadbasket. And then as far as what the major product of the South, the biggest moneymaker was tobacco. And tobacco is this new discovery, and Europe got highly addicted, and we took advantage of that, and we fed into that addiction. And so in the early years, we're only making 14 million pounds. By the dawn of the revolution, we're making 100 million pounds per year. So we're making big money on tobacco. And we're making so much money that England couldn't keep up with the amount of products that we were making. We were making so much stuff that England couldn't absorb that much stuff. And so instead we started to sell to, we kind of swooped around England and started to sell to everybody else. And we started to think, do we need England anymore? Why don't we just go around? And so because England started to lose profits, because we were starting to sell to France and sell to the Dutch and sell to the Germans and everybody else, the English got a little nervous. And this comes down to mercantilism. And so most European governments believe in the ideals of mercantilism. And that comes down to economic self-sufficiency and the idea that national wealth and power is all going to work together. But the main thing is a country should be able to produce everything it needs on its own. It shouldn't be dependent on somebody else. If you need to get all your oil from another country and you go to war with that country, guess what? You're out of oil. So you need to be able to produce everything that you need within your borders or within your empire. And so if you set up a massive empire so you have all your goods, you can go to war with anybody and win. And so that's the whole idea, is you want to produce everything you need on your own. And to do this, you set up little colonies to produce whatever you need. So if you want tobacco, we're going to set up some colonies in Virginia. If you need rice, set up South Carolina. If you need wheat, set up New York. So whatever you need, if you need fish, then we're going to set up Massachusetts. And so anything that England can't produce on its own, it's going to set up a colony, and all of a sudden, now it has access to all these goods without having to buy it from a different country. And so the purpose of the colonies is not to have the colonies kind of go off and form their own little independent realms. They are there to serve the mother country and to buy whatever the mother country produces. So if the mother country is producing a whole bunch of extra stuff, it's going to be the job of the little colonies to buy that stuff up. By the 1600s, a series of navigation acts were introduced to establish a British monopoly on the colonial market because the colonials were just getting too big and the English are getting a little bit nervous as far as that trade. They want to make more money off of this big amount of trade. So they started to pass laws saying, okay, America, this is how you're going to trade from here on out. All colonial trade must be carried on ships built and owned in Britain or the colonies. And so only English ships or American ships are allowed to be used to move anything around. So the French aren't allowed to get in on this business. This is just for us. Certain products, sugar, cotton, indigo, dyewoods, ginger, tobacco, could only be sold directly from the colonies to Britain. So they couldn't be sold, even if you got a good deal to sell tobacco to France, nope, it's got to go directly to England. And if you wanted to buy something from Europe, it had to go through England first and get taxed. And so as a result, we're starting to try to slow down the American ambition to buy and kind of be independent from the English. Now, there's some good and bad when it comes to the navigation acts. It's not all bad. If it was all bad, the Americans wouldn't agree to it, and the rebellion would have started right there. But no, there's some good and bad to this issue, and so we're going to play along with it. The main reason that we were happy and didn't rebel earlier than this is it wasn't enforced, and that we had this whole idea of salutary neglect. The king was getting enough money that he's not going to try to enforce these laws too heavily. Plus, the issue is if I take a boat and go from Boston and take that boat over to France, it's a big ocean. And so it's going to be really difficult for the king to try to hunt down any smugglers that are going to try to get around England. And so the king would have to spend more money on a navy than he would probably get back from getting those taxes. And so the king didn't enforce these too heavily. And we were happy with that, and so we just kind of ignored the laws. And so here's a picture of John Hancock, who was a smuggler. He became one of the richest men in America by just not going to England, avoiding England, and avoiding taxes as much as he could. And in their first century, it wasn't really enforced, so we were fine. Tobacco planters had a monopoly within the British market, and that they had automatic buyers no matter what. We had no foreign competition as far as shipping. We were going to use our ships or their ships, but not the French or anybody else. And we got all the benefits. We got to use the British Navy, the British Army, and we didn't even have to pay for the British Army, so we'll take that deal. There are downsides to this, and that we couldn't necessarily seek out the best deals. So we couldn't buy, sell, ship, or manufacture with great deals. So the South, which produced crops that weren't grown in England, were preferred over the North. And that the North was good at things that you could already make in England. However, if a Virginia tobacco farmer found a good buyer and wanted to sell to Paris, he couldn't take a really good deal. Even if it was a great deal, he still had to go directly to England first. We definitely had a hierarchy as far as who gets to go on the top and the bottom and all that. And that this hierarchy is always going to have the elite. These are the big landowners, the rich, wealthy merchants. And that they're going to show off their lifestyles, have fancy parties. Below that, we have the professionals, the educated, the ministers, lawyers, doctors, schoolmasters. The next step down is kind of the middle class. These are the property owners. And this is 80% of free males that are going to be farming, working their own land. The other 20%, these are the townspeople that own their own businesses. Below that, we have people that don't own land. These are the laborers, the people that are going to work in those businesses, work on those farms, but don't own it for themselves. And then below that at the bottom is going to be the slaves. And that's 90% of slaves living in the South. They are at the bottom of this social structure. And so even with this American hierarchy, it is a step above Europe in that, at least in America, you had the chance of social mobility and that there was no royalty in America. And so that if you were really rich, there was no prince holding you back. You can be rich if you have the ability to do it. And there were no cultural limitations from moving from lower class to upper class. They're not going to look down on you. Rich is rich in America. Doesn't matter who your parents were. And so we started to see a large gap between the rich and poor over time as we started to get businessmen and southern planters. And then we started to get more and more poor people with a stream of low-class indentured servants, British criminals sent over, and African slaves. And so we started to get a few rich and a whole lot of poor. And the likelihood of moving up is unlikely, but you had a better shot in America. As far as colonial culture, education, we definitely encouraged education in America. We had 9 colleges, lots of schools opened up in the north. The south, they were split up, didn't have a lot of big cities, so mostly they used private tutors. By the time of the Revolution, 75% of Americans, or white male adults, I should say, were literate and could read. We had printing presses, booksellers all over the place, 30 newspapers were going all across the colonies. And so we were starting to rise up as sort of an intelligent society. And the upper class, the intellectual elite, were influenced by the Enlightenment. We'll talk more about that later. Some Americans, like Ben Franklin, started to be known worldwide for his scientific work. As far as daily life, what was it like to live in America at that time? Food was plentiful, but pretty dull, not a lot of spices happening. The churches would have been all over the place, but they lacked heating, so they would have been horribly cold. Homes also had very poor heating, that they only had fireplaces, and which were also incredibly dangerous. A lot of people died from this. We didn't have any garbage men, so as far as who took care of the garbage, you'd throw out the extra stuff, and pigs and buzzards would roam the streets to kind of take care of that. As far as what do we do for fun, we drank a lot. 4 times as much as the average American does today. And so multiple shots per day, shots. What else did we do? Militia drills to kind of get ready for any possible war. Lots and lots of parties with dancing. Washington was known for his dancing. Gambling, we loved to gamble. Lotteries, dice games, card games, we were great at it. Our main sports would have been horse racing, card playing, fox hunting, cockfighting, but no major sports as we know them today. Those developed more in the last 100 years. As far as major holidays, in the North, no Christmas was allowed. It was seen as a Catholic holiday, and most Americans were not Catholic. Thanksgiving started to come in as a harvest festival and develop over time. Religion. Most Americans, as I mentioned, were Protestant Christians. There were 2 main branches, Anglican and Congregational. Anglican just means Church of England. It's kind of a lightened version of Catholic with a king at the head of the church. And so it's very big in the South, and so the Anglicans were all over the South, and they supported the king more. Whereas the Congregationals, in this map in pink, they were kind of the former Puritans that left England because they didn't like the Church of England. They wanted to form their own church free of kind of anybody in charge. They wanted to be in charge of their own church without a king at the top. And so the entire Congregational Church is founded on the idea that we don't want a king in charge. We want to be in charge of our own church. And so they reject the king's authority. So when the revolution happens, more of these northerners are ready to get rid of the king. That's why a lot of the Puritans moved over in the 1600s. Whereas in the South, they kept their original religion, so there was more loyalty in the South. Continued immigration resulted in more and more religions popping up and dividing, and so we had quite a variety of religions, but still the majority was Anglican or Congregational. We get a few smattering of Lutherans, and mostly those are Germans moving in. Presbyterians, those are the Scots moving in. Baptists, Catholics, and Jews are also moving in. And then a few different Reformed churches are also popping in, the Dutch, the German, the French, and even the Quakers. And so a few different examples popping up. We do get a religious revival called the Great Awakening in the 1730s and 40s. And this is where preachers really emphasize the idea that you should figure it out for yourself, that you need to have a personal relationship with God, that it doesn't always have to come from the church. You should do this on your own. So it's really preaching independence and literacy, the idea that you need to figure out how to read the Bible yourself and do it on your own. This resulted in a lot of missionary work, but one of the big features of this is that it really united Americans, regardless of a lot of these different religions, unlike the division that we saw in Europe. And so we started to become American in multiple ways. And so overall, we started to feel a little bit of independence in our culture, our religion, our economy, and feel a bit different by the end of this revolution.